Okay, this is the framing assignment where you're dealing with taking an image or making an image and then using it to frame a headline. And the context of this was a meme, something that you would actually share on social media. And you could have taken a quote or anything, or even revised an actual meme that's been going around. There are a lot of them going around right now. We're going to be looking at communication, what you're trying to communicate, at the same time how you're communicating it via the chosen image and the chosen use of typography, and then how you have laid it out and formatted it using color and using structure. And is it actually framing? Does the typographical content and the image, do they work together as an overall idea? And are they framing each other? Are they complementary so that they complete each other and they work as a unified whole and the message is really clear? So we'll start with this one since this is what we opened up on. And so the framework is fine. In other words, the memes are generally, well, they're not always, but most of them tend to be in the square format. So you can pop this onto Instagram or Twitter or even Facebook fairly comfortably. Understand that when you create things for social media, you do have to put them in different size formats and proportional ratios to fit different things. But so this is more of an Instagram idea, the square format 1-to-1 ratios made popular by Instagram. If you squint your eye, we see first of all the shirt and we see the lighter areas in the face. There's a lot of distance vertically between create and yourself. The idea there would be to close up the vertical space, because we're seeing this as its unit and this as a unit. They're not being read together because there's too much space between. The next thing is how this is relating to this. So are they centered? Is one of these more important than the other? Is the word create more important than yourself, or is the word yourself more important than create? The use of color within, we're going from a color that the magenta is very close in value to the gray background. The yellow orange, that's how it's reading on my screen, stands out because it's lighter. The YO and part of the U is very close in value to the background. The blue stands out because it's slightly darker. This looks like a light green. This stands out more because it is that much lighter than the background. So remember value contrast, which leads to legibility and readability. So this is not really legible. We can't really see it. And then readable is actually being able to read and understand the information. So legibility is it visible? Is it legible? Readable is, does it make sense? Is it communicating properly? So designers have to deal with both of those things. So if I turn this into black and white, you can see what I'm talking about. Because especially squint your eye, what stands out? This stands out and the shirt stands out. By the same token, the face is so broken up in terms of color. We're going from white to a fairly dark blue. The ears don't relate to the face. The neck is a gray. The arm is a gray. We're getting the idea of all the different color here, which is kind of a fun idea, but going as white as light and not including the ears kind of, it makes this a mask. I don't know if this was your intention, but this is actually communicating mask being overlaid because the ears and the neck and the arm are gray, rather than being something very creative where maybe everything that is human flesh is treated in the same way. So then we read the whole person, not somebody standing there with something overlaid on top. And if we're talking about creating yourself, a mask is the idea of creating yourself versus hiding yourself. Those are two different messages. So this could be less complicated and simplified in terms of color and still use a lot of very bright color. Where this as a lockup is positioned, it does work because it's sort of juxtaposing with the main part of the face. Space-wise, it would do better to be dropped. This alignment now works better with this. The positioning within the vertical and the horizontal space is a little more comfortable. It has a little more room to breathe. And if we did something like that, we wouldn't have the competition between this and this. This now supports this because of the amount of color that you have here. This becomes much more legible. Okay, this is about getting a different perspective, and I don't know that this is really helping you by expanding the kind of letter forms along that in that manner, because this calls attention and does something very different than this. This is really close to the line of the body, so it becomes a little bit hard to read. It needs a little more room. Trying to see. Okay, so we've got that there. We'll pull this down. So let's look at the overall composition here. So structurally, there's some issues. This doesn't feel centered. It doesn't feel balanced in the overall space. And one of the reasons is that your margins are all wanky. So there's less space here. There's more space over here. There's less space here. Or actually, there's more space here between the top edge and the top of the type. And there's less space here vertically. We've got a square format, so we would assume that we're dividing it into squares structurally. And that will help us with framing within the composition. That will help us create the framing itself. That will help us relate the typography to the image. So the relationship here is not done with the overall design composition in mind, and you really need to do that if you want to be a master designer. If you want to create excellent and effective design, you've got to remember how people see, how they understand, how they perceive visual information just in general. And all human beings perceive generally in the same way, just like we all breathe. Our visual apparatus is all the same. Our physiological functions are all the same. We grow in the same way. So in general, there are certain things that make us human that we as designers need to play to. And one of them is the need for balance and equilibrium. And the other is the need for understanding what's being said, understanding what is in front of us in our visual field so that we know what to do with it. Make notes about those principles and think about them, and also do some investigation, deep dive investigation into Gestalt design psychology, Gestalt principles. And I talk about them in the fundamentals class. I do talk about them here from time to time, but it's really important. And when you're trying to do something as simple as a meme, and you want to do it well, you want to pay attention to the details, the big picture plus the details. So you don't get lost in the details, but you also don't overlook them. With her being this large, that's fine, but the type is too small. So think about generally what memes are. This is more of an editorial layout, maybe in an ebook or a magazine. It's kind of asking for maybe something down here to complete the picture. If at least we take this and we recenter it, it's more balanced. Now it has some pretty cool things going on, which we need to note, and that is this kind of 45-degree thing going on. So the figure does that naturally, which is a big help. But this is hard to read. Again, it's not legible. It's readable because it separates from the background, but we're having a hard time because of the treatment of the letter forms. It's kind of like trying to be clever, but not quite working. This is okay here, but we don't get the sense of this coming into this easily. In other words, this is idea number 1, this is idea number 2, and this is the third. So we don't have this as being one thing. Whenever you take type from a horizontal direction into a vertical direction, you're going to create a gap of understanding. So you have to be real particular and real deliberate in how you go from one to another. It's not to say that you can't do it, but first of all, if you do it, it's got to be a good reason, and second of all, it's got to be done in the right way. So this, as it is, isn't working, and you really don't need all this extra junk over here. Better way to solve this, maybe all the type is doing this. And you don't have her, you don't have this visual tension that's going to draw the eye and actually serves to make the viewer uncomfortable because of the close quartered space here. It is a clever use of the figure being inverted like that, and it does capture the eye, so that was a really good choice. The separation of the figure from the gray ground works really well, but the framing here is not working, and the framing of the figure, it's not really framing, it's actually attached to the figure, so there is not enough separation for the type and the figure to work, or the type and the image to work together in the way that's going to be most effective. I would say that this needs to be a question mark and this needs to be a question mark. Same issue as in the first one, way too much space. Also, there's too much letter spacing here. We're starting to read individual letter forms rather than an entire word, because you have too much kerning going on. Your letter spacing is way too wide. This would be better served if it were maybe a sans serif rather than the script. And you could also close this down. So you've got the phoenix, which you did work out, and the tail coming out. And then you've got the background shot of, I think you said it was Sepulveda Pass in the fires. So there's a lot going on. There's a lot of things going on in this, and the framing is working okay. In other words, this is framed by this idea, and this is framed by this idea, and that works. But there's a lot of different ideas going on. Definitely bring these two together. The phoenix could actually be a lot larger because the tail is larger than the rising bird out of the ashes. So this could actually fill the space to a greater degree. So these can come out here, and maybe these go up here, and then we just have a larger bird overall. So the idea is there, but it could be adjusted. The main thing is, though, that the framing works. You've got this comfortably situated in its box in relationship to other things. And overall, this lockup is comfortably situated in relationship to everything else. So again, remember the good design is always in the details, but you cannot focus just on the details. You have to look at the whole thing. So watch the details of this sort of thing and this sort of space, because you're breaking everything up. This works really well. Overall, the one thing I would say is that this type, as it is, could easily be a lot larger. If we're looking at this and that vertical distance that the figure represents, the type block itself could be that large. So let's look at that. That way it's really coming forward. So that's basically the only change that I would make. Overall, your spacing between the letter forms creates sort of that perspective angle on, it makes sense that there's this distance related to this distance, related to this distance, and this distance, and those are proportional to the size of the different lines. So there's some good decision making there. It's just that this could relate better within the design space and to the figure. So just some things to think about. But the idea is there. It feels a little off balance too, because given this distance and this distance, they're not equal. So this feels like it's kind of squeezing over this way. So it should squeeze that way. Give the figure a little more room to walk. Okay, the sky is the limit, which basically means there aren't any limits. Very simple, nice use of directionality and the idea of a wedge coming in here, right in the middle of the picture plane. So if we look at this distance and this distance and this distance, it works fairly well. Just visually, should this be larger or should it be smaller? Should it be quieter or should it be larger? Overall, the lockup of the type. It depends upon the tone of voice that we are using with this idea. It works really well as it is. It's the overall design is making really good use of, as I said, the diagonal and the vertical positioning, the amount of space underneath and the amount of space on top, and the use of this. So overall, this is working well. And again, it's very simple. Colors are very pleasant. Colors are, focusing on the blues and the blue violets and the violets for the most part, with just a little bit of the magenta and the orange working in here. It's very thoughtful, it's very reserved, it's very introspective, because that's psychologically how we respond to blue. It's intellectual, it's reserved, it's quiet. And it talks about deep space at the same time. So the color choices are working well. We don't have a lot of clouds. We get a sense of sky because of the wing of the airplane. That's all we need. It's a very simple statement. And the use of the script versus the sans serif type works really well. Spacing is comfortable. The only thing, and this is minor, is that the space in here is a little bit crowded, given this is feeling a little crowded given this. So this could be kerned, word spaced better. The letter spacing seems to be okay. Could probably tweak this just a little bit, maybe pull the E out, a little more space between the H and the E. And that would mean that the whole word needs to back off this direction to allow the E to have more space. So leave the E here, move the H and the T that direction. The is actually could simply move better. Okay, first thing to notice again here, just like in a previous one, we have a universal design principle basically being violated, and that is we are coming in, then we're moving up, and then we have to drop down. So the idea here that this is the person being framed and being fairly small in the idea of the overall universe. So what's happening here is we have this automatic focal point because of the concentricity of the stars. And then we have this focal point. And they're not aligned. They're not aligned within the design space in a way that actually makes sense. So we're putting great emphasis here because of the scale. The vertical distance here works comfortably, so we are seeing this as a single lockup of 3 words stacked. But this, in its position related to this, really doesn't make sense. Another thing you can think about is, what if this is, do I dare disturb the universe? So you put them on an angle. So there's a variety of ways to approach this, but right now this guy actually needs to be centered because you've got a focal point here, and we would actually want that focal point centered within the square, and then this also centered and following a straight line down. So this would be here, and then you've got the guy sitting here. This could come up a little bit, so this whole thing raise, and then this would need to be raised. Probably, if we find this vertical center over here, then this needs to come up to that vertical center at least. And then the last thing is, what are you communicating? Are we talking about taking the dare to disturb the universe? Or are we talking about being disturbing or a disruptor? And are we talking about that in a positive or a negative light? In terms of messaging, your composition, your layout, your choice of type, your choice of color, how you have aligned and juxtaposed the elements so that they relate to each other, all of these have to work together. So be thinking strategically, be thinking tactically. Ask yourself in the process, is this the best way to communicate what I'm trying to communicate? But before you ask that question, you have to ask, what am I trying to communicate? When you translate this type of work to working with clients, you have to be strategic. You have to ask questions. What do I want to communicate? Who am I communicating to? What's the best way of getting that message across via layout, design, typography choices, color palette, scale, proportionality, all the things that are involved in any single design solution. So this is not just working to solve this little design assignment and frame something, and most of you got the framing idea fairly well. It's just, okay, now that you've got the framing idea, how are you going to apply it in the most effective, meaningful way? Always keep your end user in mind. It's a human being. Design is always human-centered. Design is always for human beings. Understand how human beings take in information visually. So what you design has to make sense while being disruptive and innovative and creative, so there is appeal and it gets noticed.